in the probably the 1870s or 80s. There were a lot of trees. The whole town was built in trees on an old farm. So it was part open field and also part forest. We lived in the trees. These are some of the old the camp tents that were set up. Everyone lived outdoors for the first several years before cottages were actually built. And most of the trees in Mount Tabor were chestnut. So this just is an example. Nothing was paved. It was all trees and tents. And it was a summer revival community of the Methodist Church. Then in 1917, the chestnut blight hit the US, and Mount Tabor lost about 1,200 trees in town, which completely changed the nature of the parks and also the nature of living under shade of trees for all the little cottages and homes. Emily Russell, who's now Emily Southgate, did a really interesting paper in 1977 called Mount Tabor, New Jersey, and Environmental History, where she really goes into the history of the land use in town and not only trees, but also water and the care that was given to maintaining trees and the sort of the devastation of what happened during the chestnut blight and how that changed Mount Tabor. But it did not change their concerns for and interest in stewardship of our trees in town. In fact, many of the oaks that are now aging out, are about 130 years old. So this is an aerial photo from 1930 showing Mount Tabor. This big area in the middle here, can you see my arrow? That's the golf course. So this is Route, oh, I'm sorry, go back one. This is Route 53 down here. This is Trinity Park right here. This is the golf course. Now this is all forest. Route 80 was not in yet in 1930. This is where Route 80 will go. And the green trail here is a Lynn's Trail through the forest that goes from the pond all the way through the forest out to the Native American stone structure over off of Park. So I just wanted to show this because there's been a pretty intact forest. I mean, this is already a mature forest, at least in this part. This looks a little bit younger, since 1930. This is a picture in 2000, about 70 years later, showing that pretty much, the town is the town. What's changed is some of the trees along the streets and in the parks. But that forest that's down slope and around the golf course, now you can actually see the pond a little bit better, has been there for quite a long time. And Lynn, this is today. This is 2020, where it actually shows Route 80 in there. So we have an opportunity to not only take care of the trees in our parks in our town, but also we have this forest that is part of our township that we can manage. And I think deer and invasives are an issue down there. Part of it is wetlands up in this area. There's a little stream in here. And this is sort of an old sort of mixed oak hickory forest over in this area. So anyway, I just thought I'd give a little background just to set the perspective that we actually do have forests that we can manage, and we actually have trees that we can manage in our town. So I'm gonna give back the, stop sharing. Did that work? Okay, I hand it back to the mayor.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you very much. Thank you so much to the Garden Club for inviting me here for this citizen science program that you're starting, which I don't completely understand, but I want to learn more about it, because when I think of Mount Tabor and I think of a garden club and a citizen science program, I think of some of the parts of me from my upbringing. I consider myself very much a person of faith, when that is really the foundation.
Here?
I'm sorry, what? Okay.
And, can everybody please mute your lines so we can all hear the mayor? Thank you.
Okay. So I do consider myself a person of faith, and that is the foundation and the building of Mount Tabor. I've always enjoyed the outdoors, and it's something that's a part of my upbringing. But I do consider myself a person of science. And certainly that's one thing we've learned this year, the importance of listening to science, but also when it comes to the outdoors, respecting it, because if not, bad things can happen. And certainly with being a person of faith, which you can go another step and take maybe the religious dogma out of it, which I still follow anyway, but being more of a humanist where we care about people as well. And caring for people is caring for the environment. We do it to take care of ourselves as well. It is a prudent thing to do. So I want to thank the Garden Club from the bottom of my heart for including me and inviting me to things when I was just citizen Michael with a strange idea of becoming a mayor of Parsippany, to events and to that first tree planting I went to, and continuing to invite me up for events, and also welcoming me when I just sort of sneak into Mount Tabor on my own in the middle of the day and just feel like walking around Trinity and just sort of relaxing for a little bit, and which I do. But and I will continue to do that. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm going to put myself on mute.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce Jay now. He has worked with a lot of townships, so Mayor, I think you'll find a lot of his work really interesting and applicable to Parsippany. So I've known Jay for about 20 years, and I'm really pleased to introduce him tonight. Dr. Jay Kelly is a professor of biology and environmental science at Raritan Valley Community College and a co-founding director of their Center for Environmental Studies. He holds a BA in biology and a Ph.D. in ecology and evolution, both from Rutgers University, which is where I met him. His research interests are the biology and conservation of rare plant and animal species, coastal and forest ecology, and the design and implementation of ecological land management practices that balance the need of humans with other species in the landscape, primarily through community-based research projects and partnerships that benefit both his students and the communities they serve. He received a certificate of special congressional recognition for his research and service in 2010, and he continues to do just exemplary research and teaching. He's a phenomenal teacher too. So tonight he's going to talk about the impacts, forest health and the impacts of deer and invasive species on forests in northern New Jersey and strategies for restoration. So he and his students have been studying about 300 forests in northern New Jersey, documenting how the forest understory, or the shrubs and herbs underneath the tree canopy, have changed since the mid-20th century, when deer and invasive plant species were much lower in the state. They have also studied the effectiveness of different strategies for forest restoration, including deer exclosures, hunting programs, prescribed burning, and native plantings at improving forest condition over time. That's forest health. So the goal of his research is to raise public awareness about these pressing issues affecting our forests and to encourage the implementation of evidence or research-based strategies to address them. And so I'd like to welcome Jay and to remind everybody that there will be a time for question and answers afterwards, after Jay finishes. But if you have a question that you're thinking of in the middle of it, you can use a Zoom chat function and just type a question in, and I will keep track of those. But also feel free to wait and just ask him directly at the end. So now I'm going to ask everybody to mute yourself and also to turn off your video so that we can have Jay stream his presentation as smoothly as possible. And when he's done, come on back. Let's see your faces and we can continue this conversation. Okay, so I'm going to give it to Jay now and share your screen.
All right, so hopefully that worked. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can. It looks really good.
Well, thank you to the Garden Club and to Kathy for the invitation to speak today to you all and for such a warm welcome. My interest in this subject of deer and invasive plant species really began in the past 20 years of working with the DEP and doing research on rare plant species throughout the state and seeing forest after forest suffering from the effects of overabundant deer and invasives. And I just grew increasingly alarmed about the situation. and the lack of scientific information that was available to local groups to really understand the significance of what was going on and to do something constructive about it. And so in 2013, we were really fortunate to get a grant from the National Science Foundation Sensor Program, which stands for Science Education for New Civic Engagement and Responsibilities. And the idea is to get students involved in doing real world research that's tackling matters of social importance. And having the awareness and concern that I did about these issues, as many people do in New Jersey, I thought this was the perfect subject to get our students outside, out of the classroom, and involved in trying to document the situation. The fact is, people have generally been aware about the effects of overabundant deer for at least 30 years throughout not just New Jersey, but the wider region. But there just hasn't been that local documentation that we need to really understand what's happening in our own communities and our own parks and preserves that people really need to use to create constructive management. So that was our goal, and not just to do research and publish papers and put it out there, but to really follow through and take the message to communities like this to show people what we found with our results and try to help them come up with solutions to improve the situation at the local level. And I have to say right up front that everything you're about to see is the work of our students, and I deserve next to no credit for it. I'm extremely proud of all the work that they've done over the past 6 years to really collect high quality data that's allowed us to have confidence in our interpretation of what's going on in the landscape. And I'm really just a messenger of their great work. So everything is really due to them. All right, so before we get into what's happening in New Jersey, it's really important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. The rising deer populations that we've seen over the past few decades is not only happening here, it's really a regional and a range-wide phenomenon. White-tailed deer occur, for the most part, throughout the continent east of the Rocky Mountains, and pretty much every state in their range has seen similar kinds of population growth as we've seen in New Jersey. And while we recognize this to some degree as a problem right now, deer are a really important part of our local ecosystems. They help keep things in balance, helping suppress overly competitive species or aggressive species and allow room for others to grow. They provide food resources, dispersal capabilities for many plants and for predators alike. And while we are concerned about their excessive populations right now, 100 years ago, it was the opposite. Deer were nearly extirpated from throughout their range, and it's really a conservation success story that we have such thriving populations throughout the continent today. And it's only due to the work of generations of biologists and regulators and sportsmen and public citizens alike that have allowed them to recover in the way that they have. The problem is that we've also changed the background conditions that the deer populations were responding to in a variety of really complicated ways. And the overall result is that deer populations have gone far beyond their natural background carrying capacity and are starting to cause problems for not just our gardens and our landscapes that we're all experiencing, but for local environments as well, which might not be so obvious to us. Background conditions that are really essential here are, most importantly probably, that we exterminated all of the natural predators in the 1800s. So locally, that would be the gray wolves or timber wolves, cougars, and of course, Native Americans. And without those really effective predators locally to keep deer populations in check, that was one of the key pieces that was removed, that kind of barrier to population growth that allowed them to rise to current levels. The factor that drove them nearly extinct throughout their range, including in New Jersey, was commercial hunting. It used to be legal to sell deer meat on open markets for profit, and that's what drove them nearly to extinction. Unfortunately, that was banned at the turn of the 20th century or 19th century. And in the absence of that commercial hunting, that's one more for deer populations to grow. And then on top of that, the two more recent factors are that we have much warmer winters now. So the winters are no longer as cold and deep as they were, that would kill deer in larger numbers through deep freezes. And probably most importantly, more recently, is suburban development. Deer are edge-loving species, so they like to hide under the cover of thick vegetation during the daytime, and then they come out at night into our yards and farm fields and gardens to feed on the abundant food resources there. And so the suburbs did a number of things. It created additional edge habitat by fragmenting forests and creating more edges where there previously wasn't. And the edges themselves actually have more abundant food resources as well, with berry bushes and other things typically growing there. But the suburbs also provided supplemental food resources in our farm fields, in our gardens, in our landscaping that provided more food than naturally would have been there for deer to use. And then on top of all of that, the suburbs are also really valuable refuges from hunting. So it's really difficult to hunt in dense suburbs, and that's one more factor that allows for deer populations in those areas, which occupy huge amounts of the New Jersey's land base, to really rise to excessive levels. And so we really have the perfect storm here of conditions that would favor increasing deer populations, and that's what we've seen throughout their range. And the highest populations have occurred where those conditions are the most prevalent, which is generally from the Boston area down to the DC area, so the Northeast corridor. So this is just a look at the numbers. You could look at it geographically as well, and you can see the earliest maps that are available from the late 1940s and 1950 on the top left there. You can see that deer are nearly absent from most parts of their natural range. This is just a subset in the Southeast. And these maps are a compilation from the University of Georgia and from the US Forest Service. And you can see that over time, in the coming decades, the deer populations increased to problematic levels. So the red areas there indicate highly excessive deer populations of 30 per square mile or more. And if your screen looks like mine, the right image there is probably covered by some people's faces. But you can see by the late 1980s, most of the eastern seaboard had extremely high deer populations that were likely affecting local forests in the way that I'm going to show you today. And this is one indication of that. So this is a recent study by the US Forest Service showing that almost 80% of all the forests in the mid-Atlantic region where we are located are experiencing moderate to excessive levels of deer browse. And that's the highest of any of the northern states. So this is not just happening in the southern states, it's happening in the Northeast as well. And we here are really in the epicenter of these impacts, ecologically speaking. So at the local level, it's thought that historically deer populations occurred at about 10 per square mile. And you can see the image on the left here shows you a forest that Rutgers University owns. That's their primary research forest called Hutchison Memorial Forest. And the photo there is from the early 1970s. And during that time period, deer actually occurred at that sort of sweet spot of 10 per square mile. And you can see a healthy, thriving forest occurring with the deer at that time, where every layer of the forest is present and lush and thriving. So you have ferns and wildflowers on the forest floor, shrubs and young trees growing above them. You've got a healthy understory canopy of dogwoods and other species, which are out of sight here in the photo. But all the layers are present, providing the key elements of habitat for wildlife and for the plants themselves. Unfortunately, today, most of our forests look like the two images on the right, where there's either nothing in the understory because the deer populations are too high, or in that vacuum that the deer have created, you see overabundant invasive plant species that the deer prefer not to eat unless they have to. And the last statewide estimates for the deer populations that were documented occurred in 1999, so it's a little dated at this point. But at that time, the state government estimated that we had about 30 per square mile on average, so about 3 times more than the natural background levels. And locally in central and northern New Jersey, we had as much as 70 or so per square mile. So 7 times the natural background level. And we know that these benchmarks for deer populations are really good thresholds to think about as targets for restoration, say, or for management, because when deer get above 10 per square mile, we start to see their preferred food resources disappear from the forest. So species like trillium and lilies, many of the things that you might have planted in your gardens and your landscapes, begin to be decimated by the deer. When you get more than 20 per square mile, you start to see pretty much everything shutting down in the forest. So the plant species decline, tree regeneration or reproduction declines, you have wildlife populations declining as a result, and so you have these effects occurring throughout the food web. And unfortunately, in many parts of central New Jersey today, our research has shown that we have as much as 100 per square mile or more. Our campus in the Somerville area, for example, 3 years ago, before we started deer management, had 200 per square mile. And some other places locally had more than 300 per square mile. So if 10 per square mile is what everything is adapted to, for everything to be present and in balance in the forest, you can imagine what 30 times that number will mean for all those other species that are trying to live in the forest. It's really catastrophic. And that's why we're seeing the patterns that we're seeing today. So this is our own research that we've been trying to compile for the past 2 years. We have infrared capabilities and drones that we're using to survey deer in the winter seasons to really get a handle on deer populations today. The state government is not doing statewide surveys on deer populations, and most of their estimates actually come from hunting statistics, which are biased in a variety of ways. So we're trying to get independent data to assess deer populations in northern New Jersey, where we've been studying our forests. We have a fairly large data set at this point, and what we're finding is that on average, northern New Jersey has about 80 deer per square mile. And where you are above Route 78, it's more like 70, a little bit lower than that. Where we are on our campus, it's over 100 per square mile on average. Either case, the result is desperate conditions for our forests and for the other species that are trying to survive here. And so this is just a brief preface to the research that we've been doing, showing you where our study sites are located. We're really fortunate in New Jersey to conduct forest research because we have a treasure trove of data to build upon. Rutgers researchers, beginning in 1948, began to study in really intensive ways the forests throughout New Jersey, and in the interest of really just studying basic ecological conditions occurring in forests at that time. This is kind of the dawning era of quantitative ecology, and we had some real leaders in the field that had set up shop in Rutgers. And so they and a generation of grad students went to forests throughout New Jersey, documented the conditions that were there, just trying to learn about forests in general, not thinking about deer or invasives or anything because they weren't a problem at that time, but they became really valuable resources for us to build upon to see how forests have changed since that time period. So on the bottom left, you can see when all these studies took following up on, and you can see that they all occurred prior to the deer population explosion that we've witnessed since then. And it's also prior to the invasive plant species really began to come in force into our forests. So it's an incredibly valuable background data set. And so what I spent a lot of time doing, digging through the Rutgers archives and the basements of their libraries, was to try to dig up these old studies that were done that maybe hadn't even been read in a couple decades in some cases. They're pretty dusty. But to try to relocate exactly as I could where these studies took place so that we could revisit those forests and measure exactly how they've changed since that time period by using the same methods that the Rutgers researchers did. And in the end, I was able to find a little over 60 locations where we could really pinpoint the location of those forests. And on the map there, you see all the red dots are places that we could relocate the forests. The yellow dots are places that studies occurred, but I couldn't pinpoint those locations, and so we didn't collect the data. And then being in central New Jersey, we also added to that data set ourselves to try to see what was happening locally so we could support local organizations here with better assessments of forest conditions and comparing them to that reference data set historically. So this is one of the upshots of that data, just looking at tree regeneration. So how well trees are reproducing in the forests. And researchers typically do this by breaking the trees up into different size categories. The seedlings are less than a foot tall, so these are really recent sprouts of probably the same year that you're seeing them. The seeds fall in the fall typically, and then by the following spring they're sprouting up, and maybe through the growing season they'll make it up to a foot tall. And so these are replenished year after year, and we didn't expect to see any change from past to present, although it does appear to be a fairly substantial decline. Statistically, that actually doesn't pan out because those numbers are just so variable behind the averages that you see there. The place that we expected to see the greatest change from past to present, the ones that are the most vulnerable to deer, is in that second category that I'm calling saplings. These are trees that are more than a foot tall, but less than an inch in diameter at chest height. And these are a significant indicator because these trees are anywhere from 2 to 20 years old. So it typically takes more than a year to get over a foot tall and growing under the shade of canopy trees. And in that shade, it might take as much as 20 years to graduate to that next category of small trees. And so these trees are really in a particularly vulnerable condition where it takes years for them to get out of the range where deer can browse their leaves and really do them some damage. And in fact, we see the greatest declines in that area, 80% declines in saplings from past to present. What I wasn't expecting to see is in the next category, you can also see substantial declines of 75%. And I wasn't expecting it because these are trees that are too big for a deer to browse and impact the leaves of. So a tree that's an inch in diameter or more is going to have its leaves far higher than the deer can actually reach. And the fact that we're seeing such dramatic declines is the result of the saplings having been depleted for so long. So as the small trees grow up into the next category or they die out due to competition or other factors, there just aren't enough saplings any longer to replace them and to replenish those numbers in a natural way. And so what we're seeing basically is decades-long impacts of deer that are probably more than 20 years in the making, that are already impacting our forests. And the concern is that if these small trees, and if these trends continue and we have a depletion of saplings and small trees in the forest, then similarly, when the medium and large size trees die out from invasive pests or diseases or storms from climate change or natural causes of other kinds, there aren't enough small trees to fill their ranks and replace them. And we could essentially see a loss or decline in our forests. And so that's the real pressing concern here. And it appears to be imminent that we're likely to see increasing in the next few decades. And we're actually starting to see pan out in some local places already. So just giving you some snapshots of local forests in our area here near our campus. 2 examples from just the past 2 years. You can see these ash forests that were impacted by the emerald ash borer. The trees are all dead. And whereas normally there'd be lots of young trees growing up underneath them to replace them, what we see are a mess of invasive shrubs and vines and grasses that are suppressing the native growth, as well as the deer that are factoring in, that are hidden in behind the scenes here. So we're already starting to see this play out on small scales locally. And the concern is that if these trends continue, this is going to start to happen on a much larger scale. As our trees fall down in the forest in coming storms, there just aren't other things growing up underneath them that can replace them and keep that canopy intact. And so there's a real pressing concern if we can't address these trends over time. But before we get into that and talk about what to do about it, we really need to dig a little bit down into the causes of what's at work here. Because all I've shown you really so far is just declines from past to present in our tree reproduction. I haven't necessarily pinpointed deer as the cause of those declines. I've just shown you the changes that have taken place in tree regeneration. So working in that direction, we started to study deer populations locally and compared the deer numbers to the sapling levels that occurred in the forest. And you can see really clear relationships here on the bottom left. The moment the deer populations increase, you start to see sapling numbers deteriorate and then go nearly to zero as they get to the levels that we see locally. And then on top of that, we're also seeing changes in the composition of what trees are actually surviving in the forests. So again, looking at the same 4 size categories and comparing past to present, you can see on the right side graph there, in the sapling and small trees, increases in the dark green bars from past to present. And that indicates an increase in the deer-resistant species in our forest understories. So the species that the deer like to eat the least, like beech trees, for example, are increasing in their proportions in the forest compared to the past, because the deer pressure is so great that they're the only ones that are able to survive. So we have 2 fairly good, but still indirect sources of evidence that the deer are the causes of the declines that we're seeing. But really the key piece of data that gave me confidence to give this presentation and to say what the causes of these declines are is the experimental data that we have. We're fortunate there's been lots of local groups in the past 20 years that were aware and acted early on to try to tackle these problems by putting up deer exclosures or instituting really aggressive deer management in some places. And so we went and studied the places where exclosures had been up from anywhere from 4 to as much as 20 years throughout both North and Central New Jersey. And you can see that in places that have deer exclosures for 10 to 20 years, the sapling levels return almost exactly to the levels that were present in the mid-20th century. And this is important because the only thing that's changed in these deer exclosures is deer have been taken out of the equation. Nothing else has changed. So the climate is changing within the exclosures as much as outside of it. People are still in the exclosures because these are large exclosures that have trails in them. The Duke Farms exclosure, for example, that is depicted on the right, is a square mile in size. It's a huge exclosure. And so human disturbance is still taking place. Other animals are still present. The climate still changed in there. Acid rain is still falling. The only thing that's different is you've taken deer out. And you can see within about 10 years, the sapling levels returning to those historical levels. So that's really key and really irrefutable data in my perspective that gives me confidence to say that deer are the primary, they're not the only reason, but they're the primary reason why our trees are not regenerating in the way that they did historically. The trees are not the only things that have changed. We also looked at the woody shrubs and vines, which scientists refer to as lianas, and the herbs, which we're kind of lumping as a catch-all phrase for ferns and grasses and wildflowers. And unfortunately, you can see similar levels of decline in each of those categories in the native flora. The shrubs and the herbs declined about 70%, and the woody vines about 50%. And this is really just catastrophic. I mean, it's one thing to put a number on it, but it's hard to just kind of bring home the seriousness of what this means for our forests, not just the flora, but for the fauna. And unfortunately, in that decline, we've also seen a concomitant increase in invasive exotic shrubs and woody vines and herbs that are filling in the empty spaces in those niches that have been left behind. And those cause all kinds of other problems, both for the flora and for the fauna, that I'll get into a little bit. So we're seeing really widespread impacts since the mid-20th century, wholesale changes in the composition and the quantity of native vegetation that's in our forests from past to present. And it wouldn't have been possible to understand this without having that, again, that historical data set to draw from that we're fortunate to have in New Jersey. And just as an aside, we're one of only 2 places in the entire country that has the benefit of that data set. Wisconsin is the only other place. And New Jersey's professors had kind of a competitive streak going with the professors in Wisconsin, and that's why we have this data set to benefit from. If you're not familiar with this concern about exotic invasive species, these are species that are introduced to our area from other parts of the world by humans, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. And the key piece that makes them invasive is that they cause problems once they get here. Not all exotic species that we plant in our yards or that we bring to these places are necessarily problematic. For example, most of our garden vegetables and domestic animals can't actually reproduce in the wild. They don't spread uncontrolled. They're out there. Their populations depend on us for their survival. These species are different in that they spread uncontrollably into the wild and compete with native species. They can also cause problems for agriculture as pests or weeds. They can clog waterways and create barriers for commerce. So, and cumulatively, they're amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars a year in economic losses in this country alone. And so they're a major concern. And on top of that, they're really transforming our flora. As much as 40% of our local plant species in New Jersey are now comprised, and we're talking about wild species now, they're now comprised of these introduced plant species. So we're seeing a real radical transformation of our flora in ways that most people just don't recognize because they can't identify what they're looking at. They think that if it's green, it's good, and they're happy to see it. But unfortunately, they don't all have the same value locally. And I'll give you some sense of that in a minute. If you look at our historical forest data from the mid-20th century, you could see that almost everything that was present was a native species in all of the 3 categories. And the invasive species, most of them, even in the worst forests that were studied at that time, had about 5% cover at most. The only exception being Japanese honeysuckle. 2 of the forests here in central New Jersey had about 20% cover of Japanese honeysuckle. But for the most part, our forests were intact. There were native species occurring at high densities. They were thriving during this time period. You fast forward to today, and in those same forests, those 60+ forests that we were able to relocate, you see the invasive species, at least in shrubs and the woody vines, being more or less equal to our native species. And in the worst situations, you had invasive species occupying as much as 95% of the cover. That's covered how much ground they covered in the understory. 95% of it was occupied by Japanese honeysuckle. The species that are in black there are the ones from the previous slide, so you can see how much they've changed. And the ones that are in gray are new additions, species that have been introduced and have become invasive since then. And this is just a short list of all the invasive shrubs and vines and herbs that are now taking over our forests. So we're really seeing, again, radical transformation in our forests from the flora that existed here for thousands or millions of years to within just a 50-year time span or so, being utterly transformed into something that never previously existed, thanks to the mostly inadvertent effects of human activities. One of the key factors that's driving plant species taking over our forests is another sort of background issue, and namely that's soil degradation and disturbance. So the top map there on the left is from the 1899 Geologist's report that shows forest cover in 1899, and this is where we're located here in central Jersey. The kind of backward C shape on the left there is Round Valley Reservoir today, and the big U on the center right of the screen is the Watchung Ridge around Chimney Rock and Bridgewater. And the bottom map is that same area with the forest cover today superimposed on it. So what you see there is dramatic increases in forest cover over the past 100 years. And the reason why that's happened is because we had major economic shifts and land use shifts take place during that time period. In the 20s and 30s, conditions got really difficult for farmers to survive with. So farms went out of business and the farms reverted back to forest. And in some ways, that's a really good thing, ecologically speaking. The problem is that those forests return to places where the soil had been disturbed and degraded. And if you bring those other newer, younger forests into the equation, and you look at the species composition in those places, you can see that our forests on average are actually twice as comprised of invasive species as they are by native species today. Again, with the exception of the herb layer. So, you know, this just exacerbates the conditions and the situation that I was describing earlier. You compare these old forests that are intact and have never been disturbed by agriculture to these younger post-agricultural soils or forests, and you can see that there's more than twice as many invasive species in those places as in the older forests. And just as an aside, the colors in each of those bars indicates a different species that was present. So it's not something we have to worry about right here. And when you're walking through forests, you can actually see this really clearly if you learn to identify the key kind of signature effects. So this is from Point Mountain Preserve in Hunterdon County. And walking down the trail, you move from an older forest where the soils hadn't been disturbed on the left. And you can see there's really nothing in the understory, but there aren't many invasives at least. And then I highlighted the stone wall that I was crossing on the trail, or I tried anyway. That's what the squiggly line is that you're seeing in the center of the screen. And passing into a younger forest that grew up on an old farm field. And you can see the forest there on the right is completely taken over by invasive shrubs in the understory. Japanese barberry, Japanese honeysuckle, multiflora rose, and Japanese wineberry primarily. So it's really like night and day. The forests are radically different. And the reason for concern is that these occupy a huge area of New Jersey's forests today. We did a really quick analysis of GIS data and found that almost half of all the forests that occur in northern New Jersey today consist of these post-agricultural young forests, nearly 300,000 acres of land. And so this is an enormous problem to tackle. Those of us that are working towards the management of natural lands and protected areas really have a lot of work to do to think about how to bring these 300 acres of forests back to the conditions that we need them to be in to support our local wildlife and our flora. The reason for concern does extend to those other parts of the forest, as I've said a couple times. And this is just some research that others have produced from other parts of the country to demonstrate that. So this is a study from the Allegheny National Forest in Western Pennsylvania that was about 10 years old. And there they have a number of really large enclosures where they keep deer populations at different numbers inside of them to see how vegetation and wildlife populations change inside of them. And so on the x-axis on each of these graphs, you have increasing deer numbers from left to right. And then you can see how each of the categories of plants or wildlife responds to those increasing deer numbers. So first off on the left, you can see that as deer numbers increase, tree diversity declines dramatically. Now, most of our forest insects and insects in general tend to specialize on particular plant species or groups of plant species as their food resources. Caterpillars and herbivores in particular are sensitive to the chemical cues that individual plant species release. And so as the tree diversity declined 60% in those places, that meant a lot of caterpillar species were out of luck. And so you had 80% declines in caterpillar densities. And all of our forest birds depend, at least in a certain part of their life cycle, on insects as a food resource. Even if they're primarily eating nectar or fruit or seeds, they're typically feeding insects to their young in particular. And so birds are really dependent upon insect populations. And as the caterpillars declined, you had declining bird populations as well. And so ecologists refer to this as cascade effects. And a cascade is a waterfall. So one thing basically leads to another thing throughout the food web, as a waterfall would happen. It's not just food resources where you can see these kinds of cascade effects, but also nesting resources and many other factors as well. So this is a study from some friends of mine at the Rutgers Research Forest. And again, on the top left there, that's an image of this forest in the 1970s. The other two photos are the same forest today. And they compared bird populations in the present to similar studies that were done in the 1980s, and then looked at how the birds were faring relative to their nesting strategies. So the shrub and the ground nesting birds turned out to be all declining significantly. So any dot you see here below the line on the graph indicates a declining species population. If it's a large circle, it indicates a significant decline. And you can see that every species of shrub and ground nesting bird, which I depicted here with pictures, some examples, they're all declining significantly in this forest. And even most of the mid-canopy nesters, the ones that are nesting 10 or 15 feet above the ground, because we're missing those small trees in our forests today compared to the past, many of those are declining as well. And the canopy nesting species generally are not affected by any of this. So these are, again, alarming concerns. And all of this kind of is part of the reason why we're seeing major declines happening throughout the continent. So there's been a number of national studies that have come out in the popular press. You might have heard about the insect apocalypse in the New York Times last year, and some major studies done in the United States and around the world about bird population declines. Our forest birds have declined about 20% since the 1960s, and insect populations have declined by far more than that. And there's a lot of factors that are causing this, from climate change to insecticides or pesticides in general, habitat loss in the tropics and around here. But one thing you don't often hear reaching these discussions is what's happening in our forests and other habitats as a result of overabundant deer and invasive species. And this is part of the equation in a big way. And it's not just happening in New Jersey, it's a global phenomenon because we've eradicated predators throughout most of the planet. A really good indication of this and how significant a role these predators play is this really short YouTube film. And if you haven't seen this, I'd encourage everybody to watch this and show their kids. It's the clearest demonstration that I can tell you in a compelling way of how these cascade effects work in nature. And it's a simple story of what happens when wolves were reintroduced to the Yellowstone National Park in the 1990s, which was being overrun with elk and deer at the time. They reintroduced wolves, and in a matter of years, the deer and elk herds were brought back into check. Their behaviors changed, and we saw a return and revitalization of the vegetation in the park. The insects and the birds responded, and even things like beavers and bears responded as well. And ultimately, it changed the course of rivers because all the vegetation that returned to the slopes and the riverbanks helped to reduce erosion. The beavers that returned brought the stream corridors and the rivers back to their natural dynamics. And so, as unlikely as it would seem, the return of the wolves actually not just brought the deer populations into check, it actually changed the quality of the rivers and the physical landscape themselves. And this was actually predicted and observed by Aldo Leopold back in the 1920s and 40s. He's considered the father of modern conservation biology and wrote the first textbook on wildlife management. And he has a really great book called Sand County Almanac, in a particular chapter called Thinking Like a Mountain, where he talks about how the short-sightedness of how we're exterminating predators is going to lead to the loss of mountainsides and the rivers that run through them as a result of the loss of the vegetation that's holding up those mountainsides. And sure enough, things were brought back into balance by simply bringing the predators back. Unfortunately, this isn't really an option for New Jersey as much as it might be in Yellowstone. I think the mayor and others would deal with some serious political blowback if they tried to bring wolves back to Mount Tabor, or cougars for that matter. Wolves aren't particular predators of people, but cougars are. So good luck bringing cougars back when you've got little kids at a bus stop to worry about. But it has worked in other parts of the country, and it's signs that all is not necessarily lost, and really simple solutions might be available for us to bring our ecosystem back into balance as well. Before we move into the strategies for restoration, just a quick word about invasive plant species, and to show you that they basically have the same kinds of cascade effects and impacts on our ecosystems as the deer do. Again, they're green and they're photosynthesizing, and so they're providing some services to us and to our ecosystems, holding soil in place and sequestering carbon, providing fruits for birds and nectar for pollinators. But again, the insect communities in particular, and many others as well, are not recognizing them as food resources because they don't have the same chemical cues. And so this is a recent study from just last year in Connecticut that showed that Japanese barberry, a really common invasive shrub, led to major declines in insect herbivores and the diversity of insect herbivores as well. It led to insect predators declining, detritivores, the scavengers declining. And so the insect food web was damaged tremendously by the Japanese barberry. And this, you could imagine, would lead to animal declines, vertebrate declines as well, that preyed on those insects. This is a study by an entomologist at the University of Delaware named Doug Tallamy, who's achieved some renown for his work on this subject and how to bring these concerns to our own landscapes at home. He wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home, and another excellent book that just came out, I think, last year as well. And this is from his research, showing our native species and how many of our native herbivores, the butterfly and moth caterpillars that they're supporting, and comparing them to close relatives of other kinds from other parts of the world. So for example, in the tree category on the left, I just picked 2 elm species that are native elms that support over 200 different species of moths and butterflies locally. You replace that with an introduced elm species, which are Zelkova, as an example, and not a single native moth or butterfly recognizes that as food. So even though my own students sometimes get this wrong on their identification quizzes, they mistake the Zelkova for an elm. It looks very similar. The insects aren't fooled by it, and they're not using it as a food resource. So even though there's a tree there, maybe replacing our elm, it's not supporting the local ecosystem and wildlife as a food resource as our native species were before it. In the shrub layer, you can see the 2 examples on the rose family on the right. Our native spirea is supporting dozens of different moth and butterfly caterpillars in the early stages of their life cycle. But the false spirea from Asia that's been introduced supports next to none. And these patterns actually, Talon, we found, can actually last for over a century. So some of these introduced species have been around for centuries now. And even after hundreds of years have passed since the colonial era, our native species still are not recognizing them as food. And so while eventually nature can catch up and bring some of these invasives back into balance and allow them to provide, you know, more valuable resources to our wildlife, we're not going to see that in our lifetimes and possibly the lifetime of our civilization at this pace. And so this is really a concern. On top of the wildlife and ecosystem problems that the deer populations have been causing, we all have major concerns for public safety as well. I've hit, I think, 3 or 4 deer in the past 10 years myself, and I'm not part of these statistics because it didn't reach my vehicle deductible limits, so I didn't report it. But I was fortunate in that way. More than $100 million a year is being caused in vehicle damage alone in New Jersey as a result of just deer vehicle collisions. And locally, in this part of the state in particular, we have hundreds of claims happening a year. State Farm Insurance estimates that those cost about $4,000 on average. And so this is translating into about $1 million worth of damage in just car damage, not pain and suffering and personal injuries and out of work time and everything else. Just fixing your car is leading to really dramatic costs. And so from our data, from our deer surveys, we looked at deer densities and how that related to deer collisions from local police reports. And we found, as you might suspect, when deer populations increase, you get increases in deer vehicle collisions. It's a pretty simple equation, and that's borne out in the data. We also have public health concerns. Lyme disease and many other infectious diseases that are transmitted by ticks are related to the deer problem, because while deer are not the primary reservoir of the diseases themselves, they are the primary vector that brings ticks into our yards and into our forests. They're moving them throughout the landscape. So on the left is from our own research. We find that the more deer there are using an individual site, the more ticks tend to turn up in those places as a result. And we're talking about hundreds of cases a year of Lyme disease. And again, I just finished my 4th treatment of antibiotics for Lyme disease in the past 10 years. And fortunately, I escaped relatively unscathed without symptoms. But I have friends that lives have been devastated by this disease. And I'm sure many of you know people in that category as well.
Yeah.
Tragic and unnecessary. And it's really closely related to this deer phenomenon that we're seeing. So if we want to tackle these problems and start to take better care of our forests and think about what we can do to try to help the trees reproduce and the forest to come back into balance, one solution, install deer exclosures like we saw at Duke Farms and elsewhere. You just create a barrier that keeps them out. And just so using our campus as an example to see what this would cost relative to other strategies. If we took all 76 acres of forest on our campus and put up an 8-foot deer fence, depending on what kind of fencing materials we would use, it would cost anywhere from $30,000 to $150,000 just for the materials of the fencing. And we don't have that kind of money, and the college would never pay it, but it is feasible. And it does work. We saw from the experimental results earlier that if you put up an exclosure and you maintain it and keep the deer out, you get, just like that, the trees will respond. After 4 to 7 years, you start to see lush regeneration returning to these forests. And while this is expensive, the alternatives are actually even more expensive in some cases. I'll come back to this in a second. Because we know exactly how many trees used to be in the forests, historically, we can calculate exactly what it would cost to replace the forests, or replace the trees to have those conditions return. And if you take the numbers that are missing in saplings and small trees and factor in the costs of buying and replacing them, it actually totals about $500,000. And that's without any tubes or other protections for those trees after we planted them. So while exclosures are expensive, they're actually really cost effective if we're going to get those same kinds of returns for those efforts. In the exclosures, we typically see between 3,000 and 4,000 trees per acre returning on their own without any planting, because the trees are really much better at planting themselves than we are. And if you just keep the deer populations out of the equation or reduce their numbers at least, you see the forest basically taking care of the rest of the work for us. The other benefit of the exclosures or deer management in general is that the other vegetation categories can take care of themselves as well. So if we look in those same exclosures that we studied earlier, on the right side of the page here, you can see that the native woody vines or lianas and the native herb layer actually responds really quickly and starts to take over the invasives and outcompete them. That's not the case with the shrubs, unfortunately, and it might take some extra work to suppress the invasive shrubs or to do some planting or seeding in some cases. And the reality is that at this point, after 70 years, many of our native shrub populations have been decimated for so long that there just isn't a large enough local seed source to support their recovery, even if you tackle the deer part of the equation. But the other components of the forest respond really quickly. So the trees return, the lianas return, the herbs return, simply by putting the deer populations in check. And what this tells us too is that the natives actually are more competitive in many cases than the invasive species are. The invasive species are really taking hold because the natives are being suppressed by the deer populations. So it's a synergistic effect that's happening with the invasives really responding to the deer suppressing the natives and giving them that opportunity to increase locally. The other solution that many communities and preserves have resorted to is different kinds of hunting or other sorts of deer management. And the reason for this is that we simply can't put up enough deer exclosures, and we don't want to protect all of the forests that need it. This is not just a regional, but a range-wide phenomenon, and there just isn't enough fencing materials around, and it would just create other problems if we tried to fence off every forest fragment from here to DC or up to Boston. So to tackle deer populations at this problematic level that they're occurring, we really have to think about solutions at the same scale. And hunting programs is one potential possibility. There's different ways that deer management can occur, different kinds of hunting regimes. Many park systems use recreational hunting to give sportsmen opportunities to hunt in the process of them achieving their goals of reducing deer populations. These tend to be beneficial in that they can actually provide revenue because the hunters will pay for permits, for example. But our data shows that they're not actually very effective in suppressing deer numbers enough that the forest can recover on their own. And you can see that from our summary data there on the right. If you compare historic forest conditions to places that are recreationally hunted, you get really next to no results benefiting from that. Alternative to recreational hunting is kind of the other end of the cost spectrum is sharpshooting, bringing in professional hunters with special permits from the state to bring deer populations down in one night or a few nights by culling the herd. This can be really expensive and often controversial, but it works is the bottom line. And so many communities that have the deeper pockets to afford this, like Princeton and Burnsville, have been using these methods for every year for the past 20 years to good effect. And you can see there that I've lumped it under management hunting. You get about half as many trees in the understory as you did historically, which is a major increase over what happens if you don't do anything. So there are substantial benefits ecologically from implementing those kinds of strategies at the township level. Management hunting is kind of a new regime of deer programs that have been innovated by a lot of our local nonprofits and park systems. And this is working with hunters to really hunt for ecological reasons, not for recreation. Most recreational hunters will typically take a single deer or two for the year to put meat in their fridge or to have a trophy for their wall. But the deer populations are so high now in so many parts of the state that we really need aggressive hunting to occur. And it's a lot of work to do that. Colleagues of mine have estimated that it takes about 10 hours of work for a good hunter to get a single deer. And so that's an enormous amount of work if you want them to get more than 1 or 2 deer for themselves, maybe get 10 or 20 for the benefit of the local preserve. That's going to be a lot of work for them, and it really takes kind of an ethical imperative on their own part for them to put the time and effort in to accomplish that. the benefits are that it does work when you cultivate that group of local hunters to work with, and it can be really cost effective for local groups to implement it. And then there's also non-lethal strategies that have been implemented in the past that many communities and groups are often exploring. Unfortunately, to date, those have all been not just even greater in cost, but ineffective in their implementation. And the reason for this is that in order to effectively apply the contraceptives, they typically need to be reapplied every 2 to 3 years, at least the ones that have been used historically. And for that to work, you basically have to tag the deer individually and keep track of which ones have been inoculated, and then make sure that you recurringly introduce those contraceptives. And so in captive populations of animals, like in a zoo setting, these can work really well, but in an open environment where deer are moving between township or preserve bounds, the prospect of keeping track of thousands of deer as individuals and making sure you get enough of them inoculated that it's going to bring the population down is really difficult, if not impossible, and certainly cost prohibitive for most communities to implement. And I should say there's new generation contraceptives that are always being introduced and experimented with, and so this isn't the end of the story potentially, but every one of those contraceptives also has to be approved by the state government if they're going to be implemented, and so far, none of those new generation drugs have been actually approved, and so the point is kind of moot as far as those are concerned. So unfortunately, this does not seem to represent an economical or feasible solution for towns to implement. The benefits of doing deer management in this way are that you not just get forest regeneration, but you get benefits for the other kinds of things that we talked about as well. So just like when you bring the wolves back, deer populations come into check and other things respond. Similarly, in Princeton and Bernards Township and elsewhere, when the deer populations were reduced by these programs, we saw at the same time major declines in deer vehicle collisions. So Princeton, for example, the first year they implemented these programs, reduced their deer population 60%, and that same year we saw a 60% reduction in deer vehicle collisions. So you can see major benefits to public safety as well. And this can be really valuable, parts of the story to relate to the public in order to gain support for these kinds of concerns. Because even if you're not concerned about wildflowers in the forest or a little ground nesting forest bird, everybody's going to be concerned about the safety of their kids on the roads or themselves. And many of us have experienced this directly in our pocketbooks and in our airbags. For those places that are really aggressively already infested with invasives, deer management alone might not work. And so groups like Friends of Princeton Open Space, for example, have gotten some grants from the state Green Acres program to suppress the invasives first and then put up an exclosure to keep the deer out. And those kinds of situations are much more likely to be successful. We've been working with lots of different parks and municipalities to try to give them the data they need to have evidence-based management or to see if the management they're already doing is working. So Watchung Borough, for example, had been using hunters to reduce their deer population on some parks and preserves. So we measured the number of saplings in the forest in places that were hunted versus not hunted and compared them to some exclosures in the town and found that the hunting wasn't as effective as it appeared to have been in other places, which suggested that they might need to implement some kinds of incentives to improve the results of the hunting. And these are just pictures of unhunted forests on the top. Well, actually, I'm sorry, those are hunted forests on the top, and the bottom is pictures from the exclosures. And you can see just how different those forests are in the density of their understory vegetation. So we're doing deer surveys, we're doing forest monitoring, giving public talks to raise awareness, giving tree identification workshops, anything we can do to try to increase awareness and get this data put to good use at the local level is really part of what this whole project is about for us. There's other benefits too. So we've shown that these older intact forests that have been present since the 1930s or the 1899 forest maps, they are much less invaded by these exotic species than the younger forests that are on post-agricultural fields. And we have all these amazing resources now at our fingertips with internet resources like the Conservation Blueprint website, where you can look at your town or your backyard and determine if that forest patch that you have was actually present in the 1930s, or if it was present in the 1899 first forest map that was made for the state, and identify those kinds of places that are really important to protect and maybe to target for restoration, because they're already the places that are the most intact and the most deserving of protection. It's a much higher hill to climb to try to rehabilitate these younger forests on post-agricultural soils, but the older intact forests, the closest we have to an old growth forest is something that we really want to focus on as a high quality resource for protection. And then lastly, and this is obviously near and dear to the hearts of many folks in the Garden Club, is to think about what we can do in our homes and in our landscapes as well. This map on the left here shows impervious surface cover in New Jersey, and it's a small subset of the total land area in the state that really is comprised by urban and suburban habitats, which now represents about 30% of the land area of New Jersey. So if we really want to keep our plants and animals that have been here for thousands or millions of years, if we want them to survive into the future in this state, we really have to start thinking about how we can provide habitat in our own yards and in our own communities, which most of us have not been paying attention to. And we really have tremendous opportunities here that we can really revive 30%, as theoretically at least, of the land area of the state to provide much greater amounts of habitat than we have been. And the key to doing that is choosing to plant native plant species in our yards, the species that our native insects and native animals most depend upon as resources. And in doing so, we'll also be presenting much lower pressure of invasive plant species into our local forests and preserves, because the places where most of these invasive species came from are our yards and our gardens. And it was the birds that brought the seeds into the forest, and the problem began from there. So if we can nip this in the bud and, so to speak, plant natives in our yards, we'll be benefiting wildlife directly as well as indirectly by having a less devastating effect on our surrounding natural areas. Again, I have to thank my students for all the data that they collected over the past 6 years. I mean, I think it is the most comprehensive study of forest conditions that's ever taken place in New Jersey, and it's all the result of the hard work of these young people at our community college who have just done phenomenal work that, I didn't necessarily dare to hope was possible when we got into this, and I'm just been delighted and surprised, and I'm extremely proud of all the fine work that they've done. And so this is a credit to them. And we have many other project partners as well, from local preserves and communities that have worked with us to our, the student interns by name, project partners that we've had, and funding sources. So that's that. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing, we've got a new website we're developing on our Center for Environmental Studies, which is only in its first year at this point, with lots of great pictures of students doing great things around New Jersey. So if you want more information about us, you can check out the website there at raritanval.edu/environmental studies. All right, so that's that.
Thank you very much, Jay. That was awesome.
Oh, good.
That's a lot to think about and a lot of powerful information.
Yeah, and speaking of which, if you happen to be watching this from a small screen on a cell phone or something, I'd be happy to give you the presentation in PDF form so you can look at it and take a closer look at some of the facts and figures that might not have been visible. So I apologize if that was the case, because there was a lot of details and data that might have been obscured by your screen size or how fast I was talking about it.
Thank you. That would be good. I think a lot of people would appreciate having that. Beth, do you have your hand up? We can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself. There you go.
I was just clapping, but wow, what a wonderful program. That was an eye-opener for me. Our last speaker last month said, now that I've depressed you all, there is hope. So I think we have it with this too. But wow, it's amazing how much deer have. I just didn't realize. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember the first time I saw a deer. I mean, I was on our campus, and it was a wonderful new thing for me. Having grown up in the suburbs, there weren't a lot of opportunities in the 70s and 80s to see many. And they're like rats running around in the city. They're just everywhere. And that's what you see during the day. You come out at night with our infrared drones, and it's incredible how many deer are out there.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, they're out in the yard and they don't even move. I mean, they look at you like, yeah, what's your problem?
Yeah.
So they're very friendly, and that's not good. So it's an eye-opener. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I think what surprised me was just how the normal populations have just exploded in the last 70 years. It's kind of astounding. And to see those ripple effects
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So does anybody have any questions for Jay?
Looks like Robert has his hand up.
Yeah, not really a question so much. Just on behalf of my dear friends, I would like to say that the explosion in their numbers, as pointed out by the speaker, due to human induced changes. So it might be perhaps ultimately more accurate to say that humans are the cause of the decline of the forest.
Absolutely.
Kathy, I had a
That
question.
only increases the imperative for us to take action. You know, we are the reason for this, and we are, I think, then beholden to do something about it. And there are a variety of solutions, and I've just tried to present you with the best knowledge that's available, to my knowledge anyway, about how those different strategies can work at different scales and what the costs are. And it's not for me to tell you what to do with it in your yard or your community, but you should be aware of what works and what doesn't, and what are the trade-offs.
Understood.
I would love to see wolves reintroduced to New Jersey personally.
Likewise, I'm all for it.
But I don't know that that's going to be very popular.
We already have bears and coyotes in our town.
Yeah,
We see them.
unfortunately, they're not major predators.
An onslaught against the bears, you know?
Yeah, and I think, you know, a bear hunt is a completely different story than a deer hunt. You know, there isn't the same kind of case to be made for hunting predators as there is for these herbivores, which increase at much higher rates of increase. They reproduce much more quickly, and they're much lower down in the food chain. The predators, it's a completely different ecological situation, and I think that requires a different presentation. And nothing I said here should, I think, be taken to apply to hunting bears or coyotes or anything else for that matter. It's just everything should be taken individually before those kinds of decisions are made. So I think that was a good point to bring up.
Great presentation.
Thanks.
Mary Ann had a question.
Yeah, I have a question. As a, I guess, Joe Public with a yard, what do you have, like, a source that would be best to go to look for native plants, and or a place to identify things that would be considered invasive to avoid?
Yeah, so the last screen I had there had a couple of websites that are available. There's a lot of really good books now about, in general, natives and their, you know, how they benefit certain pollinator species or butterflies and so forth. But planting natives isn't necessarily such an easy thing. You want to pick native species that belong in your town and that belong in those kinds of habitats. And there's other kinds of concerns that complicate it even further. Ideally, you want to find local seed sources so that you're not bringing in genes from some other, you know, a native population, but from Michigan, for example. You know, many of our native plant species are very large ranges, and many of the native plants that we see for places like Home Depot or other vendors, they're getting them from wholesalers that, you know, might be in North Carolina or Wisconsin. And don't belong here really any more than the invasives do. So you want to try to get local seed sources and local native plant growers if you do want to purchase them. So there are a number of those available around here. I'm not sure what's around up in Mount Tabor area, but they do exist. And in terms of the knowledge resources of picking the right plant species and right plant community to restore to your yard, I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, you have the state's expert on that subject in your garden club. If you didn't know it, Kathy Walz, who's an incredibly modest person, literally wrote the book on plant communities of New Jersey and has spent her career studying this and figuring this out. And so you can't have a better resource for that subject than you already have. And I'm sorry, Kathy. More work to do, but you deserve a lot of credit for it. And so yeah, there's a lot of resources out there, and I think that's a great thing. And more local nurseries and vendors are providing these to support the increasing interest. There's also lots of local groups that are really taking interest in this. The Native Plant Society of New Jersey and many local watershed associations are great resources that you can learn from other people that have done this and have figured out some of those details that you can learn from, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel at the local level.
Okay. Thank you.
Appreciate to reach out to those.
I mean, I'd be happy to, in the future, come up with a list of potential places we could get native plants, and to also maybe mark which non-native plant species we should not be planting in our gardens. In fact, we should remove them if possible, because they are being trailed into the woods by deer feet.
Yeah, no, well, I asked, I'm serious, like I'm asking that because you walk around my house all the time, and there are some things that have just shown up on their own that I kind of am amused by, because so many people take notice of them and comment on them, but I have no idea if there's something that's an invasive as opposed to something that would be considered native. You know, I always refer to them as the thing that the birds planted, because I didn't plant them, you know?
Yeah.
They just
Plus
show up.
the easiest way to bring natives to your yard is to stop mowing. You know, just let things grow and see what comes up. And then the trick that you have to do then is to learn to identify things. And that's a great way to become more intimate and really to begin to make those connections for yourself. But you know, many of these species will come back on their own, and you can work with those natural processes to your advantage. It'll make a lot less work for you to do if you just let the plants plant themselves and work with those processes to get the job done. You do have to be careful though, because the invasives will come in the same way, and so you have to selectively remove those when they come back.
Right, right.
But it can really work to your advantage. A little knowledge can go a long way.
Great, thanks.
It's pretty tricky. Jay, you've not been to Mount Tabor yet, but we have really postage stamp size yards for the most part. And so our plantings are very intentional. And I think unless you're in like the edges of town where you have a little more property, you could let them go like that. So I think a lot of us are interested and concerned with maintaining our small spots. I mean, I know I just planted a few native species, and like I get just tons of bees. They're pollinating during the day. They're holding on and sleeping on them at night. You know, it's pretty amazing how quickly things can turn around. And I think, you know, the issue of, you know, cultivars, basically, or nativars, it's native species that have been cultivated elsewhere in the country and sold here as native, is something that's really, you almost need to have a label on the species of where it's from to really determine that. You know, one thing we've tried to do in Tabor is like people that have like some of the native oak trees coming up just out from acorns in their yard, we transplanted them down to the pond like 20 years ago. Now they're really big trees. I mean, there's like things like that that we can do as a community. A lot of us, the trees are falling on our houses at this point. And so we're having to replace them with native trees. So like we're suggesting, well, maybe a native smaller tree, like, you know, like ironwood or surfaceberry. So I think maybe this is, I don't know what you all think, but maybe it's time for a program on native plants. Pat, I know, you know, having worked for Morris County Parks and doing a phenomenal job with native gardens, like you might have some ideas on how we could put that together. But I think, you know, there's a lot of good resources in town. I mean, I can't offer to identify every plant on your property, but if I see a really bad invasive, I can leave a little note on your door saying, maybe we could talk about this and try to remove it. But I think, Jay, your presentation on the whole ripple effect and how, you know, small changes can have big effects in a positive direction. I think we kind of have to go there right now. This is a tough enough year to deal with anyway. And I think just that positive message of focusing on native species can help our town. We have mostly parks, right? In the, you know, we have what, 300 homes in Mount Tabor?
Yeah,
something
about
like that, 300. And
yeah.
it was sort of the original cluster housing design. You know, it's like parks and then little cottages around them. But we do have that large forested area by the pond, the old farm pond, and then through the woods, kind of around towards Route 80. That you know, it's an opportunity for us to look at. I don't know how many of you, raise your hand, have actually hiked that trail that Lynn built. Yeah, it's really lovely. I mean, the first part is a little tough walking, and there are a lot of this microstegium, there's a lot of invasives in there, but once you get through past the golf course onto the other side, it's a really open, mature forest. And there's not much regeneration. I don't know, next time you walk there, look, and you'll see that there's not much coming back. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to consider getting a grant and putting in deer fencing for example, an exposure in an area and see what happens. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking because it's your questions for Jay.
Don't all ask at once.
Well, you're thinking, I mean, it's a lot to think about. So
It is. I mean, it was
um,
very interesting seeing the connection, you know, the ripple effect, the cascade effect. It's kind of interesting.
I mean, what do you think with hunting? I mean, hunting is just we're cheek to jowl in Tabor. Some roofs overlap here. There's no way.
Yeah,
To,
and hunting, I don't think hunting is an option. I don't know. Like on the deer population, only recently we were commenting on this recently, my husband and I, when we walk the dog, you have to watch where you walk up by the golf course and up at the water tower now, because there is so much more deer droppings than there has been in quite some time. For some reason this year, there seems to be many more of them out there, and it's all over the place.
yeah, we had a deer for the first time in Trinity Park this summer.
Yeah, they're getting close.
Yeah, I mean, I still have hostas. They haven't eaten all my hostas yet, but you know, they've eaten the ones that are up in the back of my house. Some of those leaves have been eaten, but the I would say last year was probably the first time that my hostas were eaten. And some houses you go by, it looks like somebody actually went out and trimmed the hosta. They're so perfectly cut that you know that there were deer there eating that last night. It's interesting.
Jay had a couple of books posted there showing, you know, strong plants. What was it called? Hardy plants that can resist deer. So there are some resources that we have that we can use to determine what plants deer won't eat, and that might help us plan what to plant and not to plant.
Yeah. I know some people use sprays and stuff like that, but that's a high maintenance way of trying to keep stuff. Once it rains, you got to go back out and spray.
Right. So Jay, thinking, you know, our last talk a month ago was about climate change and talking about the forest changing as part of that, and with changes in temperature and rainfall, precipitation, you know, big storm events that knock trees down, form gaps. Do you have anything you can tell us about, like, what we're managing towards with those changes in mind? Like, will that affect what we decide to plant or how to manage our parks and forests?
No, I hear a lot about people trying to get a leg up on climate change and starting to plant species from the south here, thinking that it's going to get warmer and those will be the best adapted to future climates. But I think that's really dangerous practice to get into, because many of our invasive species that we're tackling in New Jersey are native to some other parts of the continent. You know, one of the nastier ones around here is black locust, for example. That's a native tree in the southeast. It's rare in the mountains of the Carolinas. Here, it's a tremendously difficult invasive to deal with. It's thorny. It's really deep root systems. It creates its own nitrogen. Once it takes hold, it's almost impossible to get rid of. And so the idea of introducing, you know, new species that don't belong here, even if they're from other states, just a few states away, whether you're thinking about climate change or just thinking about what looks pretty in your yard, neither of them is appropriate for this place. And I think we'd be better served to try to just do what we can to restore what belongs here now while the conditions still exist, and let nature take its course. But in the meantime, also try to do what we can to combat climate change and try to prevent those worst case scenarios from happening, which we should have been doing for decades, and hopefully we'll catch up on that soon. So it's something to keep in mind. You know, we're likely to see more extreme heat spells, more extreme dry spells, and you can have that as a frame of reference. But there are plenty, you know, we've got over 2,000 native plant species in New Jersey, many of which also extend their ranges into the south. Maybe those are the ones that we should think about planting in our yards instead of picking native species from the south, but not New Jersey, to do that. So we have many hardy, just like the people here, many hardy rough and tumble plant species that can handle pretty much whatever you throw at them. And they provide, I think, pretty good resilient resources for us to draw from if that's the kind of thing you want to think about in your landscape designs. I wouldn't go farther than that because I don't think we're likely to see changes within our lifetime that are going to warrant bringing species from the subtropics or from that far away that they don't already occur here in New Jersey. Whatever's coming our way, but that's just, you know, my take on it. So,
Right. Yeah, I was thinking more trees, native trees that are here now that are going to have the resilience to deal with the changes in climate. Like, I don't know if it's the hickories, I think, are going to be increasing, and beeches.
yeah, well, so far there's very few trees that don't have exotic invasive pests or diseases attacking them, and hickories are one of the few so far that are holding out. Another one that's a really hardy plant species that grows in a wide range of conditions is hackberry. It grows on hills with clay caps and really nasty, crappy soils, but also in, you know, riversides with really deep, lush moisture and soil and optimal conditions. So there's a lot of really tough and valuable trees that we can bring into our communities that belong here, but maybe just haven't occurred at the same densities of what we're used to. Help us, you know, move forward into the future. But I think that's part of the work that we have to do in the coming decades to figure all that out. The first step is just recognizing that there's a problem, and unfortunately it's still well, I think there's growing public awareness about the impacts of deer on our communities because we're all hitting them and suffering from Lyme disease, and our gardens and landscapes, we get tired of replanting the same thing in our yards and our gardens over and over again. But what's happening in our forests as a result, and the imperative for supporting biodiversity as a whole, and the crisis that's happening right now is really not on the public's radar in the way that it needs to be. I mean, we've gotten a lot of attention about climate change, but not about this extinction crisis that we're in the middle of right now. And I think there's an enormous amount of work to be done, and this is part of that story. And it's related to climate change, but I think it deserves every bit as much of a direct attention itself as climate change does.
That's good advice, Jay. Thank you. It's a lot to think about. Does anybody else have any other comments or questions?
Can you hear me?
Renee, yes. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
hi, I'm Rita. I'm up here in Lake Hiawatha, New Jersey. And I want to thank Jay for a wonderful presentation. Although I must say, it really gives me agita. I really feel sick after watching it.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I know all of us on the call here are probably gardeners in some fashion and really close to the earth. And it just sort of makes you sick when you see all these invasives coming through and detriment to our environment. And it's so overwhelming that, you know, we can do what we can do in our little gardens, but that's a drop in the bucket in a way. And without being overly fatalistic here, I just wanted to ask a question. I know with your Raritan Community College, you're doing such great work with your students there. Do you have relationships with other community colleges, like up here in like Morris County, or it almost seems like we need to have a statewide, countrywide awakening and do it all together, because we can't just do our little part and think it's going to make a difference.
Yeah, so in the interest of that, I organized a conference last year in March to try to bring together academics and government officials and scientists and nonprofits together to talk about this. And we had a conference on our campus, and we had it was standing room only, 300 people from across the state came.
Wow.
Mostly general public to hear about what people had to say. And it was pretty clear and consistent that everybody's seeing and finding the same thing. They're exploring and tackling different aspects of it, perhaps, but it's the same issue. And so I do have colleagues at Ramapo and Keene and Bergen Community College that I've worked with in the past, but you know, there's very few community colleges that are doing research at all. Most of those colleges are really focused on teaching and community development. We're, I think, an exception in that regard. And unfortunately, most of the schools that are doing research, the four-year colleges and universities. Many of them are focused more on kind of either more theoretical topics or the more global or larger scale issues. And I think that's led to local issues being neglected by our land grant institutions, for example, and our other local that I think really should be providing more of a resource for local groups and communities to raise awareness and to get stuff done. So I think there are people at schools in Northern New Jersey that you could tap into as a resource, but there isn't necessarily, everybody's aware of this, but there isn't necessarily a groundswell of action happening within the universities or the academic sector to really get something done about it. And I think in some ways it's just the classic problem of a lot of talk and not a lot of action, and people in their comfort zones in academia feeling content to publish papers and teach classes, but not actually, get their hands dirty and put the hard work into it that we need to as citizens to get stuff done. So it's limited, but it is there. You just have to know who to talk to and who to turn to. And I think that while on the one hand, it's a sad statement about the nature of academia, it's also, as like I've found at our school, an opportunity. I mean, there's a need for it that's clear and pressing in our communities for good work of this kind and others to be done. And we as institutions have tremendous resources, intellectual and otherwise, at our disposal to support that. And that's what I've taken on as my goal while I'm at Raritan Valley, to try to do what I can to address these conditions locally, because I'm not satisfied writing a paper and patting myself on the back. I've spent way too much of my life depressed in the same way that you're talking about, going to parks and preserves and looking in my own yard and thinking about the situation. And the only way to get out of that is the good therapy of good work, and getting involved with other people that have shared concerns and a willingness to get their hands dirty. And it's really tremendous what can be accomplished when people get together to get stuff done, whether it's at the local level in your town with your garden club, or with statewide groups like the Native Plant Society, or people getting together to pressure government agencies to do the work that's supposed to be happening at the state level as well. So there's opportunities to get involved and to get stuff done. And I heartily encourage you to do what you can, whatever you see fit to contribute to that, if you're interested and willing. And I'd be happy to talk to you about other groups that might be around that.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. I think the first step is really the education and letting people know what's out there. I just want to share with the group here that I've done quite a bit of hiking with the Morris County Parks Department. We would do organized hikes, and then one thing would lead to another. And then I got in touch with the New Jersey Trail Conference, and tapping into them, lo and behold, I find that they have an invasive strike force, and they have a citizen project as well, where people can go out into the forest and actually identify invasive species, record them, and then it goes up into a database. So that there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's just you really just have to know where to look. And I think someone asked a question earlier about where can you learn about the natives, what's native versus what's invasive. And as you mentioned, Jay, the Native Society of New Jersey is fantastic. Just go to their website. I think they're even doing a plant sale, where you can order online from, if you want native plants. You can definitely, it's a good source for that. And they even do Zoom calls too. I went to one last month about how to grow natives without feeding Bambi, which ties directly into this presentation. It was really very good. A lot of good helpful hints about what to replace what might be a cultivar with something that's more native and just as pretty and beautiful, and feeds pollinators.
And it's stuff that you can teach yourself. Like, I never took any classes in plant identification. I just bought a wildflower identification guide and taught myself. And it's really been some of the more, it just became a passion that's been lifelong for me, because it's really just fascinating and rewarding and to learn to identify the things that are part of our communities that we've been ignoring our whole lives, and learn to recognize them by their own names or the names that we give them, and the roles that they play and how they got here and the stories that are involved in their lives that are part of our own lives as well. And the more you learn about them, the more it enriches your sense of the richness of the world around you, and the more you can contribute with informed action. So I'd heartily encourage anybody that's interested to teach themselves to identify trees or take a workshop on it. I'd be happy to give you one. I just gave one to Raritan Township last week. It's really just fun and rewarding, and it doesn't take a PhD to learn how to identify wildflowers or trees or anything else. And if you want resources or pointers or any assistance to advance on your own paths, please feel free to use me as a resource. I'd be happy to share anything I have with you from my experience.
I have to say, Jay also is an incredible teacher, and the students he's teaching on how to identify plants and how to read the landscape and how to do some of this management is really unique. There aren't that many schools that actually have plant identification coursework anymore, or even degrees in plant taxonomy. A lot of it is pharmaceuticals, but he's produced students that can now go out and do this kind of work, that can identify plants, can teach others, know how to manage the forest. And I think that's quite a gift you're giving to the world, Jay. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Thanks.
Excellent.
Yeah. And we could do a plant identification classes here. That'd be kind of fun. If
It would be kind of fun. I hope one day, Jay, you're able to get to Mount Tabor and, you know, see it for what it really is.
Sure. That sounds like an invitation.
Oh, yes.
Sure.
Always open invitation.
We're a friendly bunch.
Thanks.
Well, you have my contact information on the website and the presentation that I'll share with the club. And if you have any questions or anything comes up that you think of afterwards, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk to anybody anytime. My email is the best way to get in touch with me, especially since our office is closed with COVID right now. But don't be shy about reaching out if you have other questions and want to follow up with anything.
Thank you very much, Jay.
Thank you for your time. Yes.
And thank you all for joining. It was nice to have such a, a group that is interested in getting more engaged, because, knowledge is first and then the engagement, and hopefully that will lead to some of, even if we can do some of the things that we learned from you all, Kathy, you, that's what this is all about. So thank you all.
Thank you, Rupa.
Well, best wishes.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody. Good luck with everything.
Thank you, Jay.
Bye, Ma.
Bye. Bye, all of you.
Dinner time. Thank you for joining.
Did everybody sign on that was supposed to join us?
We had
We
like
lost some, I guess. But that's
22,
good.
23 people. It kept going up and down. Yeah.
Good.
Good
Good
night,
night,
Rob. It's good to see you.
Good night.
Okay.
Good program, Kathy. Thanks for getting him. He's good.
He's
It's
a good teacher.
eye-opener.
He's
Really
a
an
good
eye-opener.
teacher. I thought it might be a little bit technical, but I think
He explained it very
Did
nice.
it good, yeah.
he's just a good teacher. He's amazing.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Passionate about it, yeah.
And we've hired a lot of his students because
Wow.
they know what they're doing.
Great.
Yeah, so very few come out of college really hitting the ground running, knowing, like, being able to do something with biodiversity.
Yeah.
I have a request, because there are not many of us left on the call, amongst the members. So whether we could please have the business portion of the meeting later, because we've lost a lot of our members.
Yeah, I don't think we had planned to have
So
it.
let's not do that today.
Yeah, we'll do it.
Always a
next time.
problem, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you liked it. That was a good discussion afterwards
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I didn't, you don't think about what its effects are, and in the bugs and the insects that are food for other, and it just trickles down, and it's kind of scary, yeah.
And I liked your presentation in the beginning, and maybe when we get this presentation, we'll put yours and his and give it to the mayor's office, hopefully to stimulate some kind of action, so that, he learned and he listened, he let him read, and who knows, there might be something that can come out of
Yeah, the mayor contacted me at like 7:25 and said that he has to leave. He had to leave at 7:30. So I
Yeah.
said, okay, well, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for the good introduction. And then I said we'd share the video with him. In fact, we're still recording. We could probably stop recording now.
Thank you for that.
All right.
1 minute. Stop.
So we can talk